integration strategy. Taiwan is the source for much of the R&D in the mobile handset space today, coming from a lot of vendors. And Motorola, in fact, was using Taiwan quite extensively from 80, almost, well, they said from 66%, now it's gone back down to 50. But basically, China was the assembler and manufacturing side of this whole greater China integration strategy. But that is changing because many Taiwanese companies have their factories here in China. In fact, Honghai, which is the largest electronics manufacturer in the world, they make all the iPods and the iPhones, and they also make cell phones too. They are actually in Shenzhen producing just millions and millions of handsets per day, and it's a Taiwanese organization. In fact, they are the largest exporter in China, which is it's a Taiwanese company. So you can see what's going on here. It's this what I call the Greater China Integration Strategy. Let me go quicker now. Let's talk about globalization. I taught globalization at Seattle University in 2007, 2008. Was very honored to do that. What I discovered is my whole professional career involving the Chinese world had a lot to do with the globalization of things occurring, and also something I call the Pacific Century, 太平洋时期. So I've been talking about Pacific Century for about almost 10 years now. It's not a new concept, but it has a lot to do with technology. There were 3 phases of globalization that have occurred. The first phase really was us Westerners looking for a path to China and India. Marco Polo went to China. When he came back, he said, wow, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You've got all kinds of technology going on in China. This is in the 1200s. And from that point on, when the Europeans, the West, figured out that there's this mythical place called China, they were looking for a path to China and eventually India. In fact, Columbus, he wasn't looking for America. He was looking for India. He was looking for India. And what happened is from the 14th century on, this basic Silk Road occurred and started, and along the way, all these influences from Asia and from the Middle East basically influenced the Westerners, and they were looking for resources, spices, gold, everything you can imagine. Tea as well. Now, again, the Portuguese discovered Formosa. I don't know how they feel about that here, but they used to call that Ilha Formosa. The Portuguese said, wow, beautiful island, beautiful island. They went to Taiwan for a short period of time, then they eventually went back to Macau. They decided to stay in Macau. The Dutch, the French, the English, the Spanish, and even the Americans and the Japanese came later, but the Dutch East Indian Company, Jardine Matheson, Hutchinson, Whampoa, they basically colonized India, and they used, of course, opium to feed to the Chinese. So there's a kind of negative thing there. But basically, it's the West trying to open up. That's the first phase of globalization. Second phase, it's really an American lake, essentially, which is that after the Second World War, America became the mightiest superpower economically and militarily. We still are. Our economics are a different story right now. But the key point here is if you look at the reconstruction of the trading system after the Second World War, the Marshall Plan and the Dodge Plan, basically America's golden age was from 1950 to 1973. And the gold standard, which is, well, anyway, that was the gold standard then. Of course, then the dollar system came about. And the almighty US dollar is now basically what's used. The U.S. long-term competitiveness, though, it started to decline in the 80s. It started to decline because basically American manufacturers were taking technology offshore to places like Japan and eventually Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong. And then those little dragons built up their economies by exporting products back to the West, Europe, and America. Okay, so that's basically driving down American competitiveness because we're actually transferring technology. It is incorrect to think that people from another country cannot completely duplicate your product and eventually overcome the technological gap and actually create their own technology. So we're talking about innovation here, creativity coming from the original OEMs that the Western companies put their factories in Asia for mainly for the purpose of manufacturing, not to expect your competitor to outdo you. But that's exactly what's happened. That is exactly what's happened. Now, let's go to the third phase. Third phase here, which is basically China and India as well. I do a lot of public speaking about China and India. And what we're talking about is the reemergence, for this presentation today, we're talking about China's reemergence after 600 years. What we see is we see the dragon flexing its muscle. We see the dragon ever so bold and reclaiming its natural place in the trading system and also as one of the world's leaders. It's a leading country. Chinese want to be number one. They do not want to be number two. Okay? Now, at this point in time, let's keep this to discussion about Shan Zhai Ji. But the key point here is the microcomputer industry. This is what's leading the way. The technology, the electronics industry. Asia, and in particular now, the greater Chinese markets are booming. They are developing and creating new technologies. Okay? That has the West fearful. But the West transferred technology originally with a very short-term mentality. So we are basically right now looking at the situation where we want to protect our intellectual property in China. Well, I think that we have to look at the situation where many of these countries in Asia are equal in terms of manufacturing, in terms of developing technology. We have to look at that as a real obvious situation. Now, the third wave, we talk about, let's talk about how technology goes from one place to another. I think this is a very interesting point. And the Chinese are going to occur, this is going to occur to the Chinese as well eventually. The British developed the Industrial Revolution, essentially, and that was about 200 years ago, 150 years ago. But they wanted to protect it. They thought that you could keep the technology in Britain, and basically they were wrong. You can't. People left. Technology left. Technology transferred to the best place where it needs to be for innovation, creativity. Okay, so it went to the United States East Coast, up and down the American East Coast. I'm from New England. I'm very, very proud of being Bostonian. And I think the key point is when I was growing up, we were, New England was a key manufacturing center for many things. And it has been for over 100 years, if you know your American history. But things started to change around the 80s in terms of technology. So do you remember Lotus Development Corp? Remember Lotus? Remember Digital Equipment Corp? How about Wang Labs? Ring any bell? They're all gone. Why? Because they didn't understand the technology cannot be controlled. It keeps traveling to the best place where it needs to go. And in this case, it went to the United States West Coast, to the Silicon Valley, Sunnyvale, Cupertino, San Jose, and to the Silicon Forest, which is Seattle, which is where I make my home now. And basically, it stayed on the West Coast from the late 70s to the 80s to the 90s, okay? Even though technology was transferring into Taiwan in the 80s and into China in the 80s, it really wasn't until the 90s and the late 90s when this whole internet bust occurred. And then many Chinese and Indian nationals said, I'm leaving. I'm not coming back. There's better opportunity in China. I'm sick of getting laid off.